Here in chapter 7.2, the subsection that we're going to be dealing with next in the inflation chapter, we're going to continue with talking about the redistributive effects of inflation. Before we get into that specifics, let's go in and remind ourselves a couple more things about prices. In our previous set of lectures, we had a list of things that had gone down in price, which was a bit surprising given that most of us seem to feel like prices are rising, but that's why we did it, just to point out that there are a large number of things that have gone down in prices over the years. Now, in this particular slide, we have a more balanced view. We have a list of prices that rose, from some things that went up quite dramatically to some that went up only a tiny bit. And then in the second column, we have things that fell. Some fell dramatically and others only fell by a tiny bit. Let's take a look at a couple of them just to point out. For prices that rose, we see that in the year 2019, health insurance prices skyrocketed 20.5%. That's a pretty significant increase. And I'm sure most of you all who have, if you're paying for your own health insurance, you know this. Other items went up, but nowhere near as dramatically. And as we see, the last on our list was bananas. They only went up about 0.5%, 0.6%. College tuition, interestingly, went up 1.9%. Now let's take a look at the list of the things that fell in price. Television sets during that year of 2019 fell 20% just in 1 year. Absolutely amazing. And that's because the technology of producing televisions keeps racing ahead with electronic technology, and therefore prices have been falling quite dramatically in that particular field. But you notice the other examples didn't fall anywhere near as much, and then coffee fell the least in our list. It only fell 1.4%. The whole point of this slide is just to point out that some things are rising in price moderately, some things are skyrocketing in price, other things are falling in price moderately, and other things are falling dramatically in price. So what was the overall average if you blend all this together? That's what we're searching for, remember, because that was our definition of inflation. What's happening to the overall average? Well, as we can see in the center of our screen, it was a positive 2.3%, meaning if you blend all the prices together, the average went up 2.3%, even though some went down. Okay, next let's take a look at what impact does this have on incomes. Well, this is a really interesting graph. It may not look so just by looking at it, but it really tells a very interesting story. Let's first of all take a look at the orange line. That's prices. So from the year 2000 up to 2020, so roughly the previous 20 years, you can see prices went up quite dramatically from an average of 100 up to approximately 150. So that's what, a 50% increase in the overall level of prices on average over a 20-year period. That's pretty significant. So prices are, just within living memory of most people, we can see that prices have gone up a pretty good bit. But luckily, on the green line, we're measuring wages. Overall wages have gone up even faster, thank goodness. So they start at an index number of about 100 and have now gone to 180 during the same time period that prices went from 100 up to about 150. So we can see that wages are increasing faster than prices. But here's the important thing to remember about nominal prices. These wages are measured in nominal terms. So wages went up 80% during that time period. To go from 100 to 180 is an 80% increase. Wages went up 80%. Did purchasing power go up 80%? Well, of course not, because the prices you're paying went up 50%. So there was actually a net gain of 30%, wasn't there? 80% increase in your pay, 50% increase in the prices of things you pay for on average, which meant that wages were rising faster than prices, but nowhere as dramatically as the nominal numbers would suggest. So it's always important to remember that you have to adjust any nominal number for the inflation to get to a real number in order to make real comparisons as to what somebody's accomplishing economically. Now let's get back to those wealth effects, which we are going to spend some more time talking about. Remember the redistribution issues that inflation caused, what a relative price effect and income effect. Now let's take a look at what we call the wealth effect. So let's just read the first part of it together, then we'll work through the problem that is posed on here. So those who own assets that are declining in real value end up worse off. That should make common sense to everybody, and those who own assets that are increasing in real value end up better off. Let me give you an example of two different investors who've invested in some item of wealth. One chose to buy real estate, the other chose to buy a corporate bond. Again, I'm making these numbers up for illustrative purposes. Let's assume both investors back in the year 2000 had $100,000 to spend, or to invest rather. So one of them chose to buy real estate. Let's say they're buying a duplex, they're going to rent it out. The other person chose to buy a $100,000 corporate bond, earning 5% interest. So both of them appear to be equal investments. Because let's further assume, again, to make the problem more obvious, let's assume that the rental house is earning $5,000 a year in rent, and at 5% interest, the corporate bond is paying 5% interest, or $5,000 per year on the $100,000 investment. You notice they appear to be exactly equal investments. They both cost $100,000, they both earn $5,000. And you notice I deliberately picked nice, easy, round numbers. We can recognize they're earning 5%, right? Because $5,000 divided by 100,000 is 5%. So that's a 5% return. Reasonable, nothing spectacular, but just a good, solid, reasonable investment. However, now that you know that inflation's gone up so dramatically, in the previous example, we saw average prices went up 50%. Let's assume, just for argument's sake, that real estate tracked the overall price index and also went up 50%. I'm not arguing it did. I'm just saying just so we can have nice, easy, round numbers to work with. What is this rental house now worth? It's now worth $150,000. And how much rent are you able to charge on it? Well, that, of course, went up to $7,500, both of them going up 50%. If you were the owner of the real estate, you would have kept up with inflation and done pretty well for yourself, wouldn't you? What if you owned the bond, though? Bonds are written as nominal contracts where the dollar amounts don't change. So you invested $100,000 and you receive only $5,000 every single year. By the end of the 20 years, your bond is still only a $100,000 bond and is still only paying $5,000 worth of interest. Whereas the other investor now owns a $150,000 house paying $7,500 in rent every single year. Did they both get treated the same because of inflation? Do you all realize that when the original investors made their investments, they thought they were buying roughly the same level of investment? But it turned out, because of inflation, the bond investment turned out to be a really bad investment, and the real estate investment turned out to be a really good investment. Not because the original investors made brilliant investing decisions, it's because the inflation distorted the value of both of these items. So it turned out that, of course, one of the investors ended up winning and the other investor ended up losing because of inflation. Which is one of our original points, right? We recognize in every single one of these examples, one person gains from the inflation and another person loses from the inflation. So that's what I wanted you to see specifically in wealth effects. Some kinds of investments actually prosper due to inflation, others are badly harmed due to inflation. So it's pretty important you know which one it is before you start making investments if you believe inflation is going to happen. But what if we had had no inflation over the last 20 years? Through the 2000s, the inflation rate was zero. Then what would the value of that house be? It'd still be $100,000. And how much rent would you be collecting on it? Still $5,000. And the bond investor, what would his bond still be worth? $100,000. And he would be collecting $5,000 worth of interest. So do you realize without any inflation, both investments would have been essentially identical, wouldn't they? It's the inflation that caused one investment to do poorly and the other investment to do very well. And that's the part we want you to recognize. It has nothing to do with the investor's original decision as to the quality of their investment. They thought they were buying the same thing. It turned out inflation distorted the values over time. And that's what the wealth effect is. So now let's go back into this redistribution issue and do in more detail. So the redistribution, we recognize now there's a mechanics of inflation that causes redistributions. Let's go through each one now all together on one slide. The price effect says people who buy products that are increasing in price the fastest end up worse off. So we saw that from our previous slide. So the price effect of inflation harms those who are purchasing the items that go up the fastest in price. And as we saw in that yellow highlighted section in the previous slide, inflation on certain items changes quite dramatically, right? Depending on which item you're buying. So some people are hurt worse by the inflation than others, depending on what they're buying. The income effect. We know that people whose nominal income rises more slowly. I gave the example of somebody living on a fixed income from an annuity. They went into retirement, took everything they owned, went to an insurance company, bought an annuity, and the annuity pays them a certain amount of money, but that amount of money does not change. But inflation makes everything more expensive. Therefore, inflation gouges out the value of your annuity. So the income effect says those whose incomes rise more slowly or not at all, inflation hurts them worse off. And then last but not least, our last example we just did on the previous slide, people who own assets that are declining in real value end up worse off. As we saw in that example, the bond would have gone down in value as people, 20 years later, if you were given a choice, do you want to buy my bond or do you want to buy the other guy's real estate? Obviously, the real estate's been a much better deal. So people who bought bonds during inflation were harmed. People who bought real estate were helped. And again, that's money being shuffled from one person to another through no fault of their own and has nothing at all to do with whether they were good investors or whether they're doing the right thing. It just turns out inflation just rearranges the game board, so to speak. And that's why our last bullet point states that inflation acts like a tax, taking income or wealth from one person and giving it to another. And that's being done arbitrarily rather than by contract or by design or something that someone agreed upon. And that's what makes it so potentially dangerous. Because as you can see on this slide, we're picking up with the fact that social tensions are created as a result of the redistributive effects of inflation. Obviously, there's going to be big tensions between labor and management, right? During time periods of inflation, workers are going to want to get big raises, not to get ahead, just to keep up. But of course, management's going to be saying, "Oh my goodness, look at the raises we're giving you. We can't afford to do this." So immediately, inflation is going to cause a rift between management and labor as they argue over how big the raises should be, and that's going to cause a great deal of tension. There's also tension between government and the people. People feel, when they feel themselves being quote unquote eaten or gouged by inflation because their income is not rising as fast as inflation, they start to feel pretty upset about it, and understandably so, because you start to realize that you're like a squirrel in a hamster cage. You're running, but you're not moving forward. You're staying in place because everything you accomplish is being eaten up by inflation. So most societies that have a large amount of inflation generally have a great deal of political unrest as people essentially rebel against the government because of the conditions that they're living under. And of course, this ends up having the real cost of inflation, therefore, is the effect it has on morale of society, how people feel and how much they support their social system. And on the flip side, I mentioned that high inflation societies generally have a great deal of political turmoil as people rebel against the system. In societies that have relatively low levels of inflation, people tend to be much more comfortable with their government and essentially don't take politics too seriously because they don't see what the government's doing is harming them. And so people are much, much more accepting of their government, and that, of course, makes for a lot of social peace as opposed to social strife. So it's a very important thing. If you want to kind of get an idea of how this plays out in real life, just Google anytime you want to, just for fun, Google inflation in Venezuela and see what comes up and see the impact that inflation is having in Venezuela. It is horrific. That entire society is being ripped apart at the seams as people find themselves unable to keep up with the rising prices, and the government is in constant trouble with the people. So take a look at it sometime just for fun. But again, I'm not going to test you specifically on Venezuela. Now, next issue that ties directly in with this is a name that economists have given to a really interesting problem. It's called money illusion. Money illusion is the idea that people feel like they're richer when they have more pieces of money in their wallet or in their bank account, even if that money can't buy as much as it did before. Because in real terms, the money is going down in value, but people feel like they are wealthier. Okay, your author, let's just toss up the example your author uses. In the good old days, movie tickets only cost $5. You could buy a textbook for $20. I remember, well, you all are probably too young to know this, but back in the 1970s, that was a pretty common price for a textbook, 20 bucks. Nowadays, it's what, close to 100? Things have gone up dramatically in the textbook market, right? And that's because the overall inflation rate's gone up. So's prices of the gasoline. I mean, the other day I was paying close to $4 a gallon. When I was growing up in the 70s, when I got my first driver's license, I was paying 35 cents a gallon. That's a huge difference in prices, right? So we recognize that prices have risen dramatically over time. So here's the problem. If let's say, just to have some nice easy round numbers, let's assume that you were making $50,000 10 years ago. Now you're making $100,000. In your mind, if you have money illusion, you say you're richer. And that's a pretty normal thing. I'm not saying money illusion is a sign that someone is an idiot. It's the norm, because we all believe that having more money means we have more purchasing power. That's the normal meaning of having more money. And in any given year, it's true. Within the same year, before inflation's had a chance to, move forward, if you went from 50,000 to 100,000, yes, you would definitely be wealthier. If you took a new job or you graduate with your MBA and you all of a sudden jump to a new income class, the extra money is not an illusion. You really do have more purchasing power. But if this is happening over a long period of time where the inflation's had a chance to work its way into things, and I'll give you just some number examples. You start off at $50,000 10 years ago. Over 10 years, you get raises to $100,000. You're getting ready to pat yourself on the back because you think you're doing pretty well. But prices go from an index number of 100 and they go to an index number of 200. So prices doubled when you got a 100% raise. What do you think? Is your extra money making you wealthier, or are you falling behind? Remember the numbers again. You started at 50,000, you jumped to 100,000. That's a doubling of your income. Okay? But prices more than doubled. They went up 200%. So twice increase in prices. So with your extra money, now you're making 100,000 bucks a year. You cannot even afford what you used to be able to buy with $50,000 10 years ago at the lower prices. So in that example, if you believe that you are richer because you're making more nominal money, we would say that you have money illusion. Money illusion for human beings seems to be a short-run phenomenon. In the long run, it's very difficult to fool people because they can see the fact that their material standard of living is declining, even though they have more actual pay in their paycheck. So money illusion is mostly a short-run phenomenon, but it is real. People really do get fooled by this, and this is dangerous. Anytime you're fooled by anything, there's a very good chance you're going to make a big mistake on something, right? Okay, last point. Let's now do an actual set of numbers again, only this time the numbers will be written down so you can check them yourself. So let's assume that during the year 1980, the inflation rate was 13.5%. Last year, 1979, your income was $10,000. In 1980, you got a raise, a $1,000 raise. Now, how big a raise is that percentage-wise? Does everyone, again, I'm deliberately picking nice, trivially easy numbers. To go from 10,000 to 11,000 is a $1,000 increase. 1,000 divided by the original 10,000, that is what? A 10% increase. So you've had a 10% increase in your pay, but what did we say the inflation rate was? What's the average level of prices doing? It went up 13.5%. So with your $1,000 raise, are you getting ahead, staying the same, or falling behind? Is your income real income decreasing, your purchasing power decreasing? Well, of course it's decreasing, which is the whole point of such easy examples, is to get us into the habit of recognizing what the principle is behind the words and the numbers, and then of course we can apply them to the more complex set of numbers that we deal with every day in the real world. But in this example, your income went up 10%, but prices went up even faster, but to 13.5%. Therefore, your real purchasing power declined, even with a raise. Good things to always remember. During inflationary times, do not look at your raise in nominal terms as that's the final number. You must subtract out the inflation first.